There's a place inside the U.S. federal prison system where silence feels heavier than iron and time stops behaving like time. A place designed not to punish a man's body, but to unmake his mind. For more than 3 decades, one inmate lived in that space, alone, untouched, and unheard. His name was Thomas Silverstein, and his story became one of the most notorious examples of extreme isolation in modern American history. Locked inside the Supermax fortress ADX Florence, Silverstein spent 23 hours a day in a concrete cell no bigger than a parking space. Former guards, wardens, and inmates would later describe it as a living tomb. A world of flickering lights, metal doors that never opened fully, and a silence broken only by the hum of ventilation. But this story isn't just about a prison. It's about what happens when a man disappears into isolation so complete that the world forgets he exists. This is the true account of how 35 years in solitary confinement changed a human being forever. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. Thomas Silverstein's life didn't begin in a prison, but the path that led him there started long before he ever held a weapon or faced a guard. Born in 1952 in Long Beach, California, Silverstein grew up inside a fractured home where violence, instability, and criminal behavior formed the background noise of his childhood. His early environment didn't excuse what he'd later become, but made clear how a boy with no structure eventually found identity inside chaos. By the time he was a teenager, Silverstein was drifting through juvenile facilities, small, temporary cages that functioned like training grounds for harder criminals. Inside those places, tattoos became armor, alliances became survival, and violence became language. What began as a need for protection soon turned into a reputation. The more time he spent locked away, the more the outside world faded, replaced by a new reality where the most dangerous men had the most power. Silverstein learned early that weakness invited disaster. His first adult sentence came from armed robbery, a crime driven by impulse and the kind of reckless desperation found in men who never learned another way to navigate the world. He entered the federal prison system young, tattooed, angry, and unprepared for the brutality waiting inside. Federal prisons in the late 1970s were boiling over with gang conflicts, racial tensions, and overcrowding. Everything was organized by alliances. You were claimed by a group, or you became prey. There was no in-between. Silverstein gravitated toward the Aryan Brotherhood, a powerful white prison gang known for violence and rigid loyalty. Whether he joined for protection or identity no longer matters. What matters is that this choice marked the beginning of everything that followed. Once inside the Brotherhood, your path was set. You followed the rules. You backed your brothers. And eventually, the system expected you to carry out violence on their behalf. In 1980, while serving his original sentence, Silverstein was implicated in the murder of another inmate. He claimed he was innocent, and years later, even prison officials questioned whether he'd truly done it. Regardless of the truth, he received a life sentence and was placed in high-security housing. From that moment on, the system treated him as a man beyond rehabilitation. And when a system brands a man as irredeemable, it often stops trying to manage him and starts trying to contain him. In 1983, everything changed. Silverstein became involved in one of the most infamous prison murders in modern history. The killing of correctional officer Merle Klutz at USP Marion, a facility that was, at the time, the highest security prison in the country. Silverstein claimed Klutz had harassed and abused him, but the act itself was undeniable, brutal, and permanent. In the aftermath, the Bureau of Prisons decided that no traditional cell could hold Thomas Silverstein safely. Not for the public, not for staff, not even for other inmates. The solution was unprecedented: permanent solitary confinement. No human contact, no interactions, no chance of release to general population. He was moved to a custom-built isolation cell known as Silverstein's Suite, a place engineered for complete psychological containment. What started as a sentence became a living experiment in human endurance, an attempt to bury a man without killing him. Years later, experts, journalists, and human rights advocates would debate whether the punishment crossed into torture. But for Silverstein, debate didn't matter. What mattered was the silence closing in around him. Inside that cell, the world shrank from miles to feet, from voices to echoes, from days to indistinguishable stretches of gray. This was the beginning of a confinement that would last longer than some people's entire lives. 35 years locked away, watched but never touched, alive but removed. The story of Thomas Silverstein isn't a simple narrative of crime and punishment. It's a story about what a system becomes when it no longer knows what to do with a man it fears. It's a story about isolation pushed past the limits of human psychology. And it begins with a childhood that offered no direction, a prison system that offered only violence, and a single irreversible moment that sealed his fate. Before the doors of ADX Florence ever shut behind him, the groundwork had already been laid. It was only a matter of time before the system turned the key. When Thomas Silverstein first stepped into the solitary unit built specifically for him, he had no way of knowing that the walls around him would become his world for decades. At the time, it was described by officials as a non-contact, high-security environment. In reality, it was a place engineered for deprivation, an experiment in total control. His new cell measured roughly 8 by 10 feet. Concrete floor, concrete ceiling, concrete bed, a stainless steel toilet bolted into the wall, a shower that operated only with approval. There were no bars, no open view of the corridor, only a solid steel door with a narrow slot used by guards to pass food trays through. Light seeped in from a small fluorescent fixture overhead, flickering with an irregular pulse that made nights indistinguishable from days. The first months were an assault on the senses. No conversations, no human touch, no fresh air except what drifted in through vents. The silence was so complete that the hum of the ventilation system became a companion. When the door shut behind him the first day, the sound felt final, like a life ending in slow motion. Guards monitored him around the clock, not because he talked, but because he didn't. He had no reason to speak, no one to answer, no one to ask questions. The weight of that reality pressed on him day after day. Prison officials had effectively buried him alive, giving him nothing but time, endless, unstructured time. To keep himself grounded, Silverstein created routines. Push-ups, sit-ups, slow pacing from wall to wall. He counted steps, counted breaths, counted anything that defined movement. But the isolation soon made even simple routines feel distorted. Days folded into each other. His thoughts repeated themselves in loops, sometimes stretching into hallucination-like patterns. This kind of confinement attacks the foundation of awareness. Without variation, the mind loses rhythm. Former ADX inmates later described similar early reactions, talking to bugs, hearing voices, seeing shadows shift across the wall. Silverstein was no different. In the first few years, he reported that he'd catch himself thinking someone was whispering his name, only to realize it was the ventilation rattling against the metal frame. He saw patterns in the scratches on the wall, faces, shapes, illusions formed by a starving mind. Prison officials rarely spoke to him directly. Orders were given through the slot. Instructions were minimal. Staff interaction became mechanical. Food tray in, tray out, handcuffs on, handcuffs off. Even during rare movement, escorted showers, or medical checks, Silverstein remained shackled in full restraints. Wrists, ankles, waist chain. In those moments, he saw guards' faces, but their eyes never lingered. He was not a man to them. He was a threat profile. One of the earliest cracks in his mental state came from the sheer monotony of sound. Guards walking down the hallway, doors clanking, keys jangling, the echo of a distant shout from another wing. These tiny noises became markers of time. When they stopped, the silence hit harder. When they returned, the tension returned with them. Constant sound, then no sound. Constant noise, then dead quiet. It was the rhythm of psychological erosion. But it wasn't only the silence. It was the lighting. The fluorescent bulb never fully dimmed. Nights were washed in the same pale blue as days. Silverstein later said he learned to sleep with his arm over his eyes, but even then, the light seeped through. Sleep became irregular, shallow, fractured, another layer of mental wear. Letters were monitored, and visits were non-existent. For years, the only direct human voice he heard came through thick glass or from a guard delivering procedures. Without external stimuli, memory became both a comfort and a weapon. He replayed moments from his childhood, old conversations, old mistakes. Some sharpened with clarity. Others blurred until he wasn't sure if they were real or reconstructed. Time in solitary becomes elastic. Hours feel long, months feel short, and years become something abstract. Silverstein tried to mark days by scratching lines into the wall, but staff painted over them. He tried to track seasons by the temperature of the air vent, but it fluctuated without consistency. The outside world disappeared. Holidays, storms, daylight savings, none of it mattered behind a steel door. By the late 1980s, Silverstein was already years into his punishment. He had grown thinner, more withdrawn. He spoke less when guards addressed him. Some staff believed he had broken. Others believed he had adapted. The truth was more complicated. Solitary confinement doesn't simply break a person, it reshapes them into something else. Some survive by shutting down emotions. Others survive by fixating on small routines. Silverstein survived through sheer stubbornness, a refusal to let the system decide when his mind would collapse. But even stubbornness has limits. Inside that cell, he experienced long stretches of derealization, moments when the room didn't feel real, when his own hand seemed detached from him. He saw shadows move even when there was nothing there. He heard footsteps that never approached. He spoke aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. Occasionally, a guard would stop at his door longer than usual. The guards knew his reputation, but they also knew they were watching a human being erode. Some looked at him with fear, others with pity they couldn't express. Most avoided eye contact entirely. Inmates across the country would later reference Silverstein's conditions as the extreme example, the blueprint of sensory deprivation. Journalists wrote about the most isolated man in America, though Silverstein himself never heard the coverage. He was locked away from the media, from advocacy groups, from the public. He existed only within that concrete box. The first years were a battle with the invisible. Invisible time, invisible voices, invisible rules. But the damage done in those early years would shape everything that came after. Solitary confinement wasn't simply the punishment. It became the environment in which his identity was dismantled and rebuilt over and over again. Silverstein was already serving a life sentence when he entered solitary. What he didn't know was that the next 30-plus years would feel longer than the life that came before it. For a man already marked by violence, the greatest threat now wasn't what he could do to others. It was what isolation could do to him. Long-term solitary confinement isn't a sudden collapse. It's a slow, grinding erosion where the mind slips 1 inch at a time. For Thomas Silverstein, that descent began quietly, barely noticeable at first, until it became a defining part of his existence. By the time he had spent more than a decade in isolation, the damage was no longer subtle. It was structural. One of the earliest signs came through memory distortion. Silverstein found himself struggling to recall simple details, faces, names, entire conversations from his past. Memories that were once vivid became hollow outlines. When he tried to reconstruct them, they felt like scenes from someone else's life. This kind of cognitive fading is common in inmates subjected to extreme isolation. The brain slowly abandons what it cannot reinforce. Over time, even the cell itself became unstable in his perception. The walls didn't move, but their presence felt distorted. Some days, the room felt smaller, compressing inward. Other days, it felt too large, as if he were standing alone inside a hollow shell. Without natural light or environmental change, the brain begins losing its ability to interpret space. Silverstein described moments where he reached out to touch the wall, just to confirm it was still there. The worst symptoms formed in silence, hallucinations that curled around his senses. Initially, it was small things, faint whispers behind the door, distant footsteps that weren't real, brief flashes of movement in the corner of his vision. Later, the hallucinations grew more complex. He saw insects crawling across the floor, tiny, skittering shapes that vanished when he blinked. He heard voices calling his name, voices that sounded familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. In the absence of human contact, the mind generates its own company. To cope, Silverstein created mental routines. He visualized rooms he once lived in, each detail reconstructed as carefully as possible. He imagined the homes of his childhood, the shape of furniture, the colors of walls. But as months passed into years, the details fell apart. He'd picture a living room, only to realize he couldn't remember whether the couch was on the left or the right. The more he tried to fix the memory, the more it slipped away. It was like chasing smoke. He wrote letters, but writing became its own torture. Long stretches of silence made language harder. Sentences felt heavy. Thoughts drifted off in the middle of a paragraph. His handwriting changed, sloppier, less controlled. Even grammar became harder to maintain, as though isolation was sanding down the structure of communication itself. By the mid-1990s, more than a decade had passed in solitary. Silverstein's days were marked by the same routine. Wake up, stare at the walls, exercise, eat through the slot, shower with restraints, return to silence. Without the distraction of social interaction or physical movement, his internal world took center stage. And that world was growing darker. He developed compulsive rituals. He paced the cell in specific patterns. He tapped the wall 3 times before lying down. He counted every bolt on the steel door, then checked again hours later to confirm the number hadn't changed. These rituals created temporary order in a life defined by sensory deprivation. But they also revealed how thin the line between coping and unraveling had become. There were episodes, short, intense spirals, where he experienced acute panic. The walls felt too close. The air seemed thinner. He struggled to breathe, convinced the ceiling was lowering. Guards watching from outside saw only a man pacing faster than usual, sweating, gripping his head with both hands. Inside the cell, it felt like drowning. Sleep became another battleground. With lights never fully off and silence never complete, night provided no rest. He drifted in and out of shallow dreams, often waking disoriented, unsure where he was. For years, he woke believing he was falling through the mattress, only to snap back into consciousness with a violent jolt. The psychological toll wasn't only inward. Rage built slowly, fueled by frustration and the sense of being forgotten. He alternated between long stretches of numbness and sudden bursts of anger, pounding the wall, yelling into the empty room, demanding to be treated like a human being instead of an experiment. But no matter how loud he yelled, the cell didn't change. The system didn't move. Time continued its quiet strangulation. The only consistent human contact Silverstein had was during escort procedures. 3 to 4 guards in riot gear would restrain him, move him down a hallway, then return him to the same concrete box. These interactions were quick, strictly controlled, and void of any human warmth. Some guards looked at him with caution, others with disgust. But most showed nothing, emotionless faces doing a job, maintaining a distance that kept them safe both physically and psychologically. Rumors spread in the prison system about the most isolated man in America. Advocacy groups wanted access. Journalists wanted interviews. But the Bureau of Prisons kept him sealed away. They argued he was too dangerous. They argued he showed no remorse. They argued solitary confinement was the only way to prevent further violence. Whether those arguments were justified or simply convenient, they ensured one thing. Silverstein's world shrank to the size of his cell and stayed that way. In the late 1990s, a psychologist conducted an evaluation through the door, speaking through steel in a narrow slot. The assessment was brief. Silverstein gave short answers, struggling to articulate the complexity of what he felt. The psychologist wrote the expected report, inmate demonstrates signs consistent with long-term isolation stress. A clinical understatement for a decade of psychological decay. By his second decade in solitary, Silverstein no longer spoke of time in years. He spoke in seasons that he couldn't see, in numbers scratched mentally into his memory. Birthdays passed unmarked. Holidays came and went without meaning. He lived in an endless present. Living in extreme isolation doesn't simply damage the mind, it dismantles identity. Silverstein began losing sense of who he was outside the cell. The tattoos on his arms, once symbols of affiliation, became relics of a past life. His reflection in the small metal mirror didn't look familiar. Sometimes he stared into it, searching for recognition. Other times he avoided it completely. There were moments, rare, fleeting moments, where he wondered whether death would feel like release. But he also held onto one stubborn belief, that surviving the system, even silently, was a form of resistance. If the system wanted to break him, then enduring became its own kind of defiance. By the end of Chapter 3 of his life, one truth had become clear. Solitary confinement hadn't just punished Thomas Silverstein. It had reshaped him into someone who existed only in the space between silence and survival. Life inside ADX Florence. When the Bureau of Prisons finally transferred Thomas Silverstein to ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, his world of isolation became even more precise, even more engineered, even more controlled. If his earlier solitary cells were tombs, ADX Florence was the perfected blueprint. Built in 1994 to house the most dangerous inmates in the federal system, the facility operated on a simple principle: complete separation. For Silverstein, it wasn't a change in condition. It was a change in architecture. ADX was designed around sensory restriction. Every angle, every door, every hallway was shaped to prevent human contact. Inmates lived behind layers of steel and concrete. Escorted movement required multiple staff, security checks, and remote control doors. The design allowed guards to manage inmates without ever approaching them directly. For most prisoners, ADX meant 23-hour lockdown. For Silverstein, it meant even more. His cell in the H unit, reserved for the most restricted inmates, was as stripped down as possible. Smooth concrete walls, thick, reinforced steel mesh instead of traditional bars. A concrete bed rising from the floor. A shower with a time system that guards activated remotely. A small desk anchored into the wall. A narrow window angled upward, so he couldn't see anything except a slice of sky. This was intentional. Sky was allowed. The world was not. Every sound inside ADX felt engineered. Distant metal doors slamming shut, muffled voices from other units, the low mechanical hum of ventilation. But the silence between those sounds felt heavier than the concrete itself. Silverstein had lived with isolation for more than a decade before ADX. But here, the environment magnified the absence of human life. Even the architecture seemed to discourage thought, reducing the world to pure containment. The daily schedule never changed. At dawn, lights came on. Breakfast arrived through the slot. Guards inspected. More silence followed. Once a day, he was permitted recreation, an hour in a slightly larger concrete room, sometimes referred to as a dog run. It was technically outdoor time, but the ceiling was mostly covered, leaving only a narrow shaft where sunlight could drop in. To many ADX inmates, it felt like a concrete coffin under the open sky. To move to recreation, Silverstein had to be fully restrained. Handcuffs, waist chain, leg shackles. Maneuvering in them was deliberate and slow, and guards maintained distance, communicating only in curt commands. After the session ended, he was escorted back to his cell, door locked, restraints removed, silence resumed. The monotony was crushing. Inmates describe ADX as a place where time loses meaning. Silverstein, who had already endured years of solitary, experienced this on an amplified scale. Without human interaction, days blurred into one another until they formed a continuous, gray stretch of existence. Weekends were indistinguishable from weekdays. Holidays carried no meaning. Even seasons were abstract, felt only through slight shifts in air temperature or changes in the quality of light filtering through the narrow window. In this environment, Silverstein's mental routines became a lifeline. He exercised with mechanical discipline, push-ups, sit-ups, pacing the floor, stretching until his muscles burned. Physical strain gave him something to anchor himself to. On days when his mind felt like drifting, the movement pulled him back into his body. He also read. Books became companions. Dense philosophical works, legal texts, thick novels that occupied time. He wrote letters, though they were heavily monitored, often delayed. When he spoke with advocates or lawyers, it was through thick glass and strict constraints. But even those conversations were rare. ADX kept interactions minimal by design. The psychological toll grew visible. Guards later recalled moments when Silverstein would sit motionless for long periods, staring at the floor. Not sleeping, not reading, just sitting in stillness, as if the world outside his thoughts had evaporated. He developed a quietness that went beyond behavior. It became part of the atmosphere around him. Even among other isolated inmates, he seemed alone. There were periods when he struggled with paranoia. He believed the walls held microphones. He believed guards listened to his breathing. He believed the shadows in his room shifted at night. None of this was unusual. Long-term solitary confinement often produces these symptoms. The brain, deprived of external stimulation, begins creating its own internal distortions. At the same time, Silverstein wasn't unaware of what was happening to him. He wrote that he felt himself sliding. He described how isolation made thoughts echo against each other. He acknowledged the hallucinations, the anxiety, the confusion. He was trapped in a reality he fully understood was destroying him, yet he had no power to alter it. This awareness, knowing exactly what the isolation was doing to him, made the suffering sharper. But beneath the decay, there was another layer, a strange kind of adaptation. Humans, even in extreme confinement, find ways to survive. Silverstein built a mental world within the cell. He rehearsed conversations with people he hadn't spoken to in decades. He created imaginary routines. He visualized landscapes he had never seen. He traced memories repeatedly, trying to keep them alive. Some survived. Others faded until they felt like fragments he couldn't place. One of the few stimuli he received came from the small window. He watched the sky obsessively. Clouds moving, light shifting, a bird passing overhead. Tiny, simple things that became enormous in meaning. That slice of sky was the only proof that the world still existed beyond concrete walls. As years at ADX passed, Silverstein gained a kind of mythic status among inmates and staff. Some saw him as a symbol of the system's harshest capabilities. Others saw him as a warning, a reminder of what happens when violence leads a man to the most extreme form of punishment. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. No other inmate in the federal system had lived in more isolation for more years. By his third decade in solitary, Silverstein had spent more time alone than most people spend living entire lives. The transformation was complete. He wasn't the man he had been in the 1970s. He wasn't the man he had been in the 1980s. Even his memories of those identities had blurred. What remained was a man shaped entirely by concrete, silence, and survival. ADX Florence wasn't just the place Thomas Silverstein lived. It was the place that redefined what life meant for him. The final stretch of Thomas Silverstein's life inside ADX Florence was defined by a strange contradiction. He was both completely forgotten by the world and yet constantly monitored. Cameras tracked his movements. Microphones captured his breathing, and a rotating cast of psychologists and guards recorded notes about a man who had lived longer in solitary confinement than almost any human in modern U.S. history. By the 2000s, Silverstein was no longer the violent, impulsive man who entered the federal system decades earlier. Age had sanded down the sharp edges. His body had weakened, joints stiffening from decades without natural sunlight or real exercise. But mentally, he had built a powerful inner structure. an architecture of coping mechanisms that kept him alive when any normal person would have collapsed under the crushing weight of isolation. What made Silverstein remarkable wasn't the crimes that brought him into the system. They were brutal, but not unique by federal prison standards. What made him infamous was endurance. He outlasted nearly every prisoner, every warden, every policy shift. ADX Florence itself aged around him. There were moments when the system attempted to reassess him. Periodic mental health evaluations, by regulation, were supposed to determine whether isolation remained necessary. But those evaluations were mostly procedural. He was the ghost of Marion, the cautionary tale of the Bureau of Prisons, the name synonymous with unmanageable. Removing him for solitary would have been viewed as too risky, too politically costly. So the cycle continued. One more year, one more decade. Inside his cell, Silverstein kept the few things that connected him to the outside world. Letters from supporters, drawings he mailed out periodically, and books, hundreds of them rotating in and out. He read philosophy, psychology, history. He sketched with the precision of someone who had nothing but time. His art became an unexpected lifeline. He mailed pieces to people who wrote to him, forming small connections that functioned as proof he still existed. Every so often, he would write reflective essays about his life, the system, and what decades of solitude had done to him. These weren't excuses or attempts to paint himself as innocent. They were observations, calm, brutal, unfiltered. He acknowledged the violence of his past without denying its consequences. He also pointed out the reality that long-term isolation didn't rehabilitate a person. It suspended them in a permanent psychological winter. What made Silverstein's case disturbing wasn't just the duration of his solitary confinement. It was how normalized it became. Most staff working at ADX by the 2010s hadn't been born when he first entered lockdown. To them, he was simply part of the structure, a fixture, an institution within an institution, the man in the box. But the truth was this: the Tommy of the early prison years no longer existed. If solitary confinement is meant to break a person, Silverstein adapted in a way few could. He created meaning where there was none. He maintained routines. He practiced a strange form of introspective discipline that allowed him to survive psychologically. But survival was not the same as living. Holidays came and went. The world outside underwent enormous change. Presidents shifted. Entire generations were born, lived full lives, and died. Silverstein's environment never changed. A cell, a door, a slot for food, a single hour in an empty recreation cage. The monotony became a form of time distortion. Days blended, years dissolved, decades vanished. And yet, despite everything, he remained articulate. His letters were lucid and philosophical. His thoughts sharp. His emotional awareness surprisingly developed for someone deprived of normal human interaction. Many staff quietly admitted that he was far calmer and more stable than inmates who had been in solitary for a fraction of a sentence. The irony was staggering. The man the system labeled as its most dangerous asset was, in his later years, one of its most disciplined. But his body eventually began to fail. Being in a cement box for over 3 decades, breathing stale air, lacking sunlight, barely moving, came with a predictable cost. His heart weakened. His bones thinned. His organs strained from chronic stress and environmental deprivation. Even the Bureau of Prisons, which traditionally avoids publicizing health declines, quietly acknowledged his medical fragility. In 2019, Thomas Silverstein died at age 67 after complications from heart issues following a lengthy hospital stay. He died outside the concrete box only because the box had finally eroded the body inside it. His death certificate listed clinical causes. The real cause was 35 years of isolation, something no medical chart would fully articulate. And when news broke, the public reaction was split. Some saw him as a murderer who finally met a natural end. Others viewed him as an example of state overreach and psychological cruelty. Activists argued that no human should be held in solitary for that long, regardless of their crimes. Former guards offered mixed perspectives. Some insisted he was too dangerous to integrate. Others admitted the system never had a plan for what forever solitary would realistically mean. The truth sits somewhere in the space between punishment, policy, and human fragility. Silverstein's story forces a question most institutions would rather avoid. What happens to a person when you remove them from the world for longer than some countries have existed? His case will likely be studied for decades, not because he was innocent, but because he was extreme. A boundary test, a human experiment in endurance and isolation. A real-life demonstration of what solitary confinement becomes when stretched to its absolute limit. No one will ever live that exact sentence again. Policies have changed. Public scrutiny has intensified. Even ADX Florence, with its hardened reputation, has adjusted the long-term isolation standards. Silverstein was an artifact of a harsher era, one the Bureau of Prisons now tries to distance itself from. But the imprint of his story remains. A man walked into the federal system in the 1970s. Through violence and circumstance, he became the face of Supermax isolation. And for 35 years, longer than some lifetimes, he lived alone in a cell designed to erase him. He was never erased. His art survived. His writing survived. His name became a permanent, uncomfortable reminder that even the most dangerous prisoners are still human, and that the line between justice and cruelty is thinner than most people want to admit. The echo that didn't die. Thomas Silverstein's legacy is not redemption. It is not exoneration. It is endurance. His story forces anyone watching, reading, or learning about him to confront a single haunting truth. You can lock away a man's body, but you cannot lock away the implications of what you've done to him. His life in solitary remains one of the most extreme in modern American history, a mirror held up to a system that rarely examines itself. And long after the door to his cell was opened for the last time, the echo of that confinement still resonates, raising questions the world has yet to answer.